Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to note the 110th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide by having an entire show that's focused on Armenia-Diaspora relations. And why this topic is because obviously the size and the extent of the Armenian diaspora is greatly impacted, was actually driven by the first Armenian Genocide. And then we're going to move on to the specifics of the misunderstandings or understandings between the Armenian state and the Armenian diaspora, specifically on this issue. And actually, the genesis of this show, in many ways, is a quote that I read from an academic, which I have a lot of respect for, Mr. Viken Cheterian, in which he was discussing the very infamous meeting that happened between the Armenian Prime Minister and the Swiss Armenian diaspora, after which he said, thus, in his brief 2-hour discussion, we witnessed 3 decades worth of accumulated misunderstandings between the political leaders of the nation state and the diaspora. He is 100% correct. Just to explain what the meeting was and the controversy was, during the meeting, the Prime Minister went on and on about the uses of the Armenian Genocide by foreign actors to prevent Armenian statehood, things that frankly didn't make a lot of sense, but obviously made sense to him, about why this issue wasn't raised until the 50s, essentially implying that this was an issue that's used by other people to divide us from our destiny of creating a nation state. This has obviously been followed up by endless nonsensical comments by this government about this issue and by the Prime Minister himself, which frankly are completely unnecessary and don't really help in the process of building these relations and actually having a concrete understanding of history and moving forward. And I think when you look back at this, there's sort of a philosophical background where there's a very practical background about where this misunderstanding comes from. I think there's distinct issues between this particular Prime Minister and this government and the diaspora, because I think in his mind, the diaspora as it is constituted now is a dashnak one. This is in the mind of the Prime Minister, and at the same time, most diasporan leaders think of him as an uneducated provincial journalist that has no business running the country. The Prime Minister is obviously wrong about his assumptions about the diaspora. The diaspora is far wider than the ARF or the Dashnak world, but he's absolutely correct about the perceptions of him among diaspora leaders. They actually do look down on him, if people are being honest about it. On the diaspora side, there's such a massive level of negative propaganda against Armenia abroad that people really don't have a fair understanding of what's going on in this country. And the other thing that's important to note, and I think this is the heart of a lot of these matters, especially when it comes to our relations with our neighbors, is that there's a lack of understanding of the real security challenges that this country has at this point, actually the specific significant shortcomings that we have in the ability to defend ourselves, which sort of colors a lot of these decisions that are made and the reaction you get from the diaspora. But if you want to step back and sort of go back 30 years of the entire life of more than 30 years of the Armenian Republic, we need to understand that I'm going to go through sort of the failures on each side. On the diaspora side, there's not a single diaspora institution that was set up to be able to build a nation state. None of them were focused on nation building. The primary institutions of the diaspora never grasped the difference between a state and what it is, a national project. Those are completely different things. States have very specific needs. A national project is really the wider dreams of an entire nation state, all of its goals, angsts, and all the things combined. Why the state has very specific needs, foreign policy, defense, economy. It's a far more practical agenda. And I think closing on this particular subject, the victory in the Artsakh war actually gave the governments in Armenia far too much credibility and essentially pushed diaspora institutions from not focusing on state building, because after all, if a nation state at its beginning and under blockade and under very difficult circumstances can win a war is not a state that you really need to help. And you see this, like there was not a single think tank in Armenia, a serious one, prior to 2021 when APRI was established by AGBU. So you see all of this going on. There's also, you see tensions actually within the diaspora, between the old diaspora and the new diaspora. Classic diaspora institutions were never designed or were never really capable of grasping and integrating the post-Soviet collapse immigration that happened. There's rivalries between, these very centralized lobbying efforts that you have in different places and younger people now, which have completely different politics, and none of them have really been integrated into the larger effort. And we have to ask ourselves, the term diaspora is frankly too wide of a term. What are we discussing here? A diaspora that includes Kim Kardashian and Margarita Simonia and Nubar Afeyan is really not a functional entity. You really have to focus on the parts that are usable for the purposes of building a state. And on the, and this is a sensitive topic, but there's a very specific arrogance that comes out of the Armenian diaspora about Armenians in Armenia, in the sense that you don't need to be blind to people's shortcomings, but you have to put yourself, in their shoes and the trauma and all the things that I've gone through. And that inability to do that actually is the beginning of a lot of misunderstandings between the two sections. Now moving on to the failures of the state side in this, looking at it, there's never been an Armenian government that's actually had a comprehensive program on how to use the diaspora for state building. It's been bits and pieces here and there. And no government, and governments one after another, have actually come up with any kind of an institutional resilience of a program that goes on for decades, focusing on using diaspora for state building. And failure to do so has actually had spectacularly negative results because the reach of the Armenian diaspora is exceptionally long, and the Armenian diaspora is actually located in some of the wealthiest countries in the world with tons of very influential people. I'm sad to say that actually the Azeri state, to the extent that they have a made-up imaginary diaspora, have actually utilized it much better than our government ever has. And I'll give you a perfect example about Azeris that moved to Israel, most of them Azeri Jews or Soviet Jews, and they have been masterfully used to create relationships with that country, something that we have not done with almost any country around us. Another uncomfortable thing is what I call the Armenian male ego problem, in which everyone is an expert on everything and you don't need any help, which is the bane of so many of our problems, is the inability to understand, or the inability to actually say, there are people that know more about the world than I do, and I need your help, especially on top levels or leadership. All of this, one of the biggest pitfalls is not using these advantages in the field of diplomacy, defense, and economic development. And part of it is because, in truth, no Armenian leader over the last 34 years, maybe to some extent this one, has actually been focused on state building. After all, what did state building mean in a country in which the Russians made all the important decisions, down to picking who was the foreign minister or the defense minister up until 22? Enough of talking about the past. When we're looking about moving forward, both sides need to understand things about each other. I'm going to start with the diaspora side. I think the first thing that diasporas need to grasp is that this is not the Armenian of old, where $10 or $15 million raised in a telethon actually makes a dramatic difference in anything. Armenia is no longer a poor country. It's a country with a lot of poor people in it, but it is no longer a poor country. The national budget in Armenia, the expenditures are close to $9 billion this year. In fact, by world standards, Armenia has a high middle-income country, and that's different from Western standards. This is when you put in the entirety of the world. Obviously, there's always room for charity, and I wouldn't discourage anyone from doing that, especially when we're dealing with Artsakh refugees and a half a dozen things like that. However, I think the focus should not be to come here and give away your money. It's to come here and make money. And I always laugh when I see foreigners who are here setting up businesses, from all over the world and doing quite well, while we have a lot of diaspora Armenians that have an impression that this is still 1995. The diaspora also needs to understand that the primary mission of the Armenian world has to be Armenian state building, because at the end of the day, without a strong Armenia, you're not going to have a diaspora that survives. And we've seen this over millennia around the world. And you also have to understand that the primary job of the Armenian state is to serve the citizens of Armenia first. That does not mean that it can't do other things or stand up for the rights of Armenians in other places, but the primary mandate of this government, or any government in Armenia, is actually to deal with the rights of the citizens of people living here. Now let's go over what the Armenian state needs to understand about the diaspora. First of all, the diaspora, as it is constituted now, is as unbelievable assets that other nations can only dream of. And realistically, you cannot supercharge state building in Armenia without actually engaging the best and the brightest in the diaspora because of their level of competence and the experience that they have in countries that are frankly far more important than Armenia. A perfect example of this would be someone like Daron Acemoglu, who just won the Nobel Prize in Economics, who's a famous Armenian economist in MIT. Could you imagine him being here for 2 years as the primary advisor to the economics minister or even the prime minister? It's something that is entirely doable. We can take example from other nations, like the country of India has a vast diaspora, but they focus on the most critical people who are running big IT firms, and they sort of weaponize them in state building and then helping their national interests. When we're looking at it realistically, there are actually two diasporas. There's the millions of people out there who are important and they need to be engaged in Armenian things and kept as part of the greater Armenian life. But in reality, what we have is what I call the golden 300. And what are the golden 300? These are the 300 Armenians around the world that come up from the highest levels of finance. They're either billionaires, they're high positions in Wall Street, whether they're have high positions in the military-industrial complexes or militaries, different countries, all the way from Hollywood agents to tech titans on Silicon Valley, stretching from Russia to Argentina and half a dozen different places. These are people that need to be worked very specifically, and you actually create networks to use them. And this could be literally a singular office, either in the Prime Minister's office, the MOD, or in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that actually is focused on using the connections that these people have to essentially weaponize the personal relationships of the Golden 300 to move these processes forward. I'm going to give you a perfect example of this, and this was done by essentially a small group of people working with our technology minister in Armenia, and that is to get Starlink to Armenia, which was literally done after many failures over a course of 10 months by essentially 10 people that are very influential, that will go nameless, working with the technology minister in Armenia who actually made this happen. And I'll give you another perfect example of an asset that is out there that we need to use, which is a fantastic asset. A lot of people don't notice, but the second largest ethnic group in the Ukrainian army, fighting in the latest war, the most sophisticated war in history, are Armenians. There's about 12 to 15,000 Armenians serving in the Ukrainian army. One day, that war is going to end. Imagine bringing 100 or 200 of these people to train our NCOs and our officers. They will supercharge all of our military reforms. And again, this is something that is entirely doable. Then we can move on to the realm of diplomacy. We have some very good diplomats, but being honest, we're still lacking in the number of really good diplomats that we need. We can easily upgrade our diplomatic corps by bringing retired Armenian CEOs, people from diplomatic services in the United States, France, and other places to actually either work as ambassadors. Well, if you change the laws, you can do that. Or if you as commercial attaches in different Gulf countries, there are countless numbers of these people that can be brought in to upgrade our foreign ministry. Now we're going to move on to the distinctions and symmetries between Armenia and diaspora. While it is true that the mandate of the Armenian state is to focus on the citizens of Armenia, it simply does not need to be limited to that. We are a global nation, in fact, like many other global nations, so it is entirely legitimate for the Armenian state to actually look after or speak up for the interests of Armenians from around the world, from Jerusalem to Syria to Artsakh. It's entirely legitimate. And you see other countries doing it. You see the Hungarian government standing up for minorities in the nearby countries. Obviously, Israel does this around the world for Jews. So the Armenian state may not have a legal responsibility, but it certainly has a moral responsibility to defend the rights of Armenians around the world. And we see this very sad lack of response from the Armenian state on what's going on in Jerusalem, because they just don't think it's that important, which tells you how limited their understanding of the world is. Because if any other country had the assets that we had in Jerusalem, they would turn the world upside down to keep them. If the Azeris had something like that, they would spend $100 million to buy out the hotel or buy out whoever to keep those assets, because they simply don't have it, things that we have in the natural. In truth, the mystic cords of memory that tie this greater Armenian international world together can actually be used to build and functional nation state that can both stand up for itself, become affluent, defend itself, while at the same time standing up for the rights of Armenians around the world. For anyone with vision and understanding, it's clear that there are no contradictions between these two goals. Thank you for joining me this week's episode of Insights.